last photo of an extinct bison to the photo of an extinct bird species, here are 7 photos and pieces of footage of these animals that are gone forever. Starting with the Reunion giant tortoise. If you picture a giant tortoise, you likely conjure images of the Galapagos or Aldabra. But there was another island paradise once teeming with these gentle giants. Reunion, a volcanic island in the Indian Ocean, and the tortoise that called it home, Cylindrospes indica. These behemoths could reach over 110 centimeters in length and weigh upwards of 200 kilograms or 441 pounds, which is roughly the same weight as a fully grown grizzly bear. But unlike bears, these tortoises were gentle, curious creatures completely lacking in fear, qualities that would ultimately doom them. It's in the 17th century, and the European sailors are just arriving on Reunion's shores for the first time. And what do they find there? In huge numbers? An inexhaustible resource for their voyages. None other than the tortoises themselves. They had 2 main uses for the tortoises. Firstly, the meat was a source of food for the hungry crews. Secondly, the tortoise had a lot of fat under their shells. The sailors would melt it to oil, which they could burn in lamps to provide light on the ships or back in Europe, and perhaps to help keep machinery or tools working. And to keep a supply of fresh meat for the incredibly long sea voyages across the vast Indian Ocean, sailors wouldn't kill all the tortoises at once. Instead, they would capture many of these large, heavy creatures alive. They would then haul them onto the ships and stack them, sometimes upside down, in the ship's hold. These living tortoises were a kind of walking pantry, kept alive until the crew needed a fresh supply of meat during their weeks or months at sea. And the result? The coastal populations vanished almost immediately. By 1800, the few survivors had retreated to the highlands, where they managed to cling to existence until the 1840s. But even the mountains couldn't save them from the relentless hunting pressure and the introduction of invasive species. Pigs, cats, and rats ravaged their nests, feasting on eggs and killing any hatchlings that managed to emerge. This photograph, taken in 1894, likely captured one of the very last Reunion giant tortoises in existence. And while the Reunion giant tortoise faced extinction through exploitation as a resource, other species met their end despite being seemingly invincible in their realms. Of all recently lost species, none embody this paradox more profoundly than the majestic Barbary lion. The Barbary lion, also known as the Atlas lion, was once the undisputed monarch of North Africa's wilderness, which stretched all the way from Morocco to Egypt. You could see them sporting thick, dark manes that extended over their shoulders and belly. Unlike their savanna-dwelling cousins further south, these guys could weigh up to 600 pounds, or 272 kilograms, and so tipped the scales like a grizzly. They were over 11 feet in length, similar to that of a saltwater crocodile. For centuries, the history books told us that the last wild Barbary lion was killed in 1922 by a French colonial hunter in Morocco. But recent research has revealed a more complex and even more tragic final chapter. According to evidence published in 2013, isolated populations of these magnificent creatures may have persisted in the hidden valleys and remote forests of Algeria and Morocco for decades longer. As the true extinction came gradually, a death by 1,000 cuts spanning centuries. One of the biggest causes happened thousands of years ago because of the Romans. They killed thousands in their gladiatorial games, depleting populations across North America. For example, during the lavish games celebrating the dedication of Pompey the Great's theater in 55 BCE, historical accounts mention the slaughter of as many as 600 lions in a single event. Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome, in his own writings called the Res Gestae, boasted about the games he gave. He proudly stated that over his long rule, about 3,500 African animals were killed in the arenas during his spectacles. While that number includes leopards, crocodiles, and bears, you can bet a huge chunk of them were the prized Barbary lions. This was because killing exotic animals, like lions, symbolized the power Rome had over the world. In the 2nd century CE, Emperor Commodus was known to personally slay lions and other beasts in the arena, often with a spear or bow as a show of his strength. But the final blow came with European colonization in the 19th century, when trophy hunting became a trend among the rich. French officers in Algeria wrote extensively about hunting lions throughout the mid to late 19th century. Men like Jules Gerard, who called himself the Lion Killer, became famous back home for his hunting exploits. Another thing is that the colonial governments actually encouraged the killing of lions, seeing them as dangerous pests that threaten livestock or people. Historians examining budget records or financial ledgers in French Algeria have found entries explicitly listing payments made as bounties for the destruction of lions, or similar wording under pest control expenses. The scattered survivors retreated deeper into the Atlas Mountains. Sightings became so infrequent that by the early 1900s, most Western scientists had already declared them extinct. However, locals had a different story. In 1956, several witnesses on a bus reported seeing a lion near the town of Sétif in Algeria. Tragically, the forest where this sighting occurred was destroyed just 2 years later during the French-Algerian War, likely eliminating any remaining individuals. Statistical models suggest that the last Barbary lion probably perished around 1958, possibly as late as 1965, which practically makes it one of the few proven extinctions directly caused by war. This is the last photo of a Barbary lion, photographed by Sir Alfred Edward Peace in 1893. He was ironically both a conservationist and hunter, and documented these creatures just as their numbers were plummeting toward oblivion. The lion in his photograph would have been among the last of a healthy population, born during a time when their future was already sealed by the colonial powers flooding into North America. And while the Barbary lion ruled as a fierce predator, another creature, far less menacing but equally fascinating, once roamed the grasslands. It was none other than the heath hen, which was basically the East Coast's version of a prairie chicken, a chunky grouse that once roamed coastal areas from New Hampshire to Virginia. These birds were so abundant in colonial America that some flocks were so large they'd darken the skies. But unlike its Midwestern cousins that still survive today, this subspecies has completely vanished from our planet, with the last one disappearing in 1932. So what happened to this once super common bird? Well, that's where things get interesting, and frankly, a bit depressing. You see, the heath hens were hunted relentlessly for food as they became a cheap, common source of protein, especially for servants and the poor. And unfortunately for the hens, they were very easy to catch. As mostly ground dwellers, these guys were terrible flyers, even when startled. They couldn't just zoom off into the sky like any other birds, only able to manage a clumsy little flutter or a short hop, which wasn't much of an escape. But what really sealed their fate was how little fear they showed towards humans. They just didn't seem to get that people could be a threat. On top of that, as European settlers expanded across America, they cleared forests and converted open land to farms and towns, destroying the heath hen's native habitat. By 1870, the mainland heath hen population was almost gone, hunted to oblivion, with the only remaining birds living on Martha's Vineyard, an island in Massachusetts where about 200 individuals clung to existence. And although conservation efforts seemed to work incredibly well, with the population shooting up to almost 2,000 birds by the mid-1910s, the heath hen faced a devastating chain of events that killed off the only hope of preserving their population. First, a massive wildfire tore through the island, destroying about a third of their habitat and killing roughly 80% of the population. But the reason the fire was so devastating was because, in the years leading up to it, conservationists suppressed natural wildfires, which allowed dense brush and trees to overtake the grasslands the heath hens depended on. And when the fires finally came, it burned hotter and spread further, meaning, instead of helping the hen population, conservation efforts actually had the opposite effect. This was worsened when winter came around, as the snow covered the ground, making it harder for the hens to find food, like seeds, insects, and vegetation. It also made them even easier targets for predators like foxes and birds. Specifically, northern goshawks, basically the fighter jets of the hawk world, who moved onto the island and started picking off survivors. And by 1917, fewer than 100 of these guys remained. Now, there was a possibility that a heath hen could have repopulated their species. However, there was one last problem that stopped them from doing this, and it was that the remaining population had a gender imbalance, with way more males than females. Meaning, there were way fewer births, as females can only reproduce a limited number of times per year. This was especially unfortunate as some males even started harassing females, destroying nests in attempts to father the next brood. Then came the genetic issues. When a population drops to such small numbers, inbreeding becomes inevitable. Scientists attempted captive breeding, but discovered many males had undeveloped testes, either from poor diet or the stress of captivity. In 1927, only 11 males and 2 females remained, and by year's end, only males were left. The very last heath hen was a lonely male nicknamed Booming Ben. For 4 years, he would return to the traditional mating grounds, inflate his throat sacs, and perform his elaborate courtship display, calling for females. That would never come. Ben was last seen on March 11th, 1932, and then simply vanished into history. And while the heath hen strutted its way into extinction, another bird with a similar unfortunate fate, and perhaps a much better sense of humor, once haunted the forests: the laughing owl. The laughing owl, New Zealand's only native owl, officially bowed out in 1914, though rumors of its ghostly cackles floated around until the 1930s. By then, the show was already over. Now, this wasn't just some slow, tragic fade into obscurity. No, the laughing owl's exit was more like a punchline ruined by bad timing. At first, they got along fine with European settlers. Well, awkward roommates, but manageable. Then, in the 1880s, humans dropped the ultimate ecological prank by unleashing stoats, ferrets, and weasels to deal with another invasive species, rabbits, because, of course, turns out, mustelids have terrible taste and humor. They didn't just eat rabbits, they went straight for the native wildlife, including our poor, chuckling owl. These owls had already been struggling in the North Island before the mustelid invasion, so when those furry little assassins showed up, it was game over. The last confirmed specimen was a dead one from South Canterbury in 1914, but like any good ghost story, the laughing owl refused to vanish quietly. For years, people swore they heard its call. Proof of survival? Sadly, no. And just like that, New Zealand's only endemic owl went from laughing to legend. The haunting photograph captures a laughing owl, or weka, perched amongst the fronds of a tree fern in the Wellington region of New Zealand, taken sometime between 1889 and 1910 during the twilight years of this species. The laughing owl cackled its way into history. But another lost legend once galloped through the wild, the tarpan, the original untamed horse. The tarpan, a horse shrouded in mystery and often romanticized as the wild ancestor of European horses, like the Conic, likely vanished from the wild between 1875 and 1890, with the last captive individual perishing in 1909. Hunting undoubtedly played a significant role in the tarpan's demise, driven by its value for meat and hide. On top of that, as human populations expanded, vast forests and steppe were cleared and converted into farmland for pasture, leading to a steady loss of the tarpan's habitat. This forced tarpans into smaller, more isolated regions, often closer to human settlements, where they were seen as pests or competitors to the farmers, as they ate the grass and vegetation needed to feed their livestock. So, farmers decided to drive them into extinction by hunting them and even crossbreeding them with domestic horses, which led to the disappearance of genetically pure tarpans. Unfortunately, by 1780, all tarpans were killed, and the last free-roaming herd was captured in Poland's Białowieża forest. This intriguing photograph, taken in 1884, is the only tarpan ever photographed. It was an 18-year-old male seen at the Moscow Zoo, and it was named Cherson tarpan. The desert rat kangaroo was a small marsupial first documented in 1843, inhabiting the kind of place you'd expect to find on Mars. The Sturt Stony Desert, located in central Australia. By the end of the 19th century, scientists had already declared the species extinct, but they were wrong, as specimens were surprisingly discovered in 1905 and then again in 1931 and 1935. The final confirmed specimen was collected in 1930, which marked what many believe was the beginning of the end of this poor marsupial, and there were several reasons why it went extinct. Let's start from the beginning. It is during the 18th and 19th centuries, when the European settlers began arriving in Australia. They want to make the new land feel more familiar, like their homes back in Europe. So, they do what anyone would do, which is to bring animals they knew. The settlers introduced red foxes, possibly for sport, and to mirror the tradition of fox hunting in England. They also brought over domestic cats as pets and to control mice around settlements. Some of these cats escaped or were abandoned, becoming feral, meaning they lived and hunted in the wild. Tragically, Australia's native wildlife, including small mammals living in places like the Sturt Stony Desert, had evolved over thousands of years without needing defenses against such clever and efficient hunters. So, when these new predators spread across the country and reached the desert, they found the native rodents to be easy prey. On top of that, European rabbits, which also arrived during the 19th century, had population explosions, which resulted in them outcompeting the rats for food and shelter. The rabbits found ideal conditions with few natural enemies to keep their numbers in check. So, with hordes of them munching through the vegetation, there simply wasn't enough food left for the native creatures. Another problem that the bunnies brought for the desert rat was to invade their shelter and leave them out in the cold. You see, rabbits dig burrows for shelter, and their sheer numbers meant they took over the best spots, leaving less safe hiding places or homes for the native rats and mice. Finally, the spread of sheep and cattle farming damaged the land even more by eating all the vegetation and caused damage to the soil by compacting it with their heavy weight, making it hard for plants to grow and thus hard for rats to find food. Because of these reasons, in just over a century, this unique marsupial had disappeared from its ancient desert home. And by 1994, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, made it official, declaring the desert rat kangaroo extinct after a 60-year absence of verified sightings. However, even though the species is officially considered extinct, there have been unconfirmed sightings over the years, with the most recent one reported in 2013. People describe seeing a small, short-faced animal hopping through the remote desert, which led to several scientists to search the area. They installed camera traps, checked predator droppings for animal remains, and conducted DNA testing, all in hopes of rediscovering the species. This sad photograph was taken in the 1930s by Hedley Herbert Finlayson. Now, we shift continents and ecosystems entirely, moving from Australia's deserts to the mountainous forests of Eurasia to look at the fate of a much larger, powerful animal we lost to extinction: the Caucasian wisent. The Caucasian wisent, a subspecies of the European bison, specially adapted for mountain life, is a tragic example of a creature lost to human pressures. Slightly smaller than its island cousins, the Caucasian wisent boasted shorter, rounder hooves, perfect for navigating steep slopes, thicker horns, and a less shaggy coat, ideal for the warmer Caucasian climate. Sadly, this magnificent creature disappeared from the wild in 1927, leaving behind only a handful of photographs and mounted specimens as a remainder of its existence. So, what led to the downfall of this impressive bovine? For centuries, the magnificent wisent roamed peacefully. They munched on grasses in high meadows during the summer and browsed for twigs and bark in the forests during winter. There weren't many people living deep in the mountains, so the wisent had plenty of space and food. But then, things started to change. More people began moving into the Caucasus region. They needed places to live, so they started cutting down the forests to build homes and villages. They also cleared land to grow crops and raise farm animals like cattle and sheep. This didn't sit well with the wisent. Firstly, their home, the forest, was shrinking. Secondly, the grassy meadows they loved were now filled with cows and sheep eating the same food. There wasn't always enough to go around. Then, things got even worse. Big wars, like World War I and the fighting that followed in Russia, brought chaos to the mountains. During these tough times, there wasn't anyone to enforce the laws, and many people were desperate for food. Soldiers and hungry villagers hunted the wisent without any limits. It was uncontrolled and devastating. Wisent's population reduced drastically, from around 2,000 in the 1860s to a mere 50 by 1921. Poaching delivered the final blow, and in 1927, the last 3 known Caucasian wisents were killed, marking the end of this unique subspecies in the wild. And although a single captive bull named Caucasus lived in Germany until 1925 and helped start a new bison bloodline, the true Caucasian wisent was lost forever.